Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this third and final day of a very special edition of DevOps Days Kyiv from home. In this, a special and extraordinary time. Over the past couple of days, we've heard some talks from some amazing speakers from across the industry. We've had an opportunity to ask them some questions and, of course, get their answers. We've also heard from some of our amazing sponsors for this event, so thank you very much. And we've heard also from you, the community, in the chat, in the breakout sessions, in the Zoom rooms. So, of course, thank you very much for that as well. Before we begin, I do just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors without whom this would not be possible. So I'd like to give a warm thank you to Wix. They're a leading cloud-based web development platform. They got more than 150 million users worldwide. They were founded on the belief that the internet should be accessible to everyone to develop, create, and contribute. I'd also like to thank PeriMatch Tech. They are a high-tech R&D center of the global holding company PeriMatch. PeriMatch Tech's an innovative provider of future-defining tech solutions in gaming and entertainment, and they're committed to innovation to provide the global community with the highest quality betting products and gaming experience. We'd also like to thank AB Soft, a software development team based in Odessa. They cover all stages of the development lifecycle, from engineering to quality assurance and the product after release. Finally, we would like to thank Shalb. They're a DevOps as a service company that designs, builds, and maintains infrastructure for high-load projects. All right, so thank you again for attending. We've got a great, about a half hour, I suppose, lined up. I would like to welcome to the stream. Whoa, I gotta turn that down. I would like to welcome to the stream a man who frankly needs no introduction. And so since he needs no introduction, I'm just going to make one up. I first met this individual while attempting the summit of Mount Everest in 1922. We were 1 week in. We had made second base camp at the foot of the so-called Edmunds Tower, so named for its astounding vertical climb. We were about 4 hours in to that climb, and we realized we had miscalculated. We were desperately out of oxygen. We were, of course, contemplating abandoning our ascent when, as if out of nowhere, someone came down from the summit, silently handed his extra bottles of oxygen to us, and continued along his way. Somewhat flabbergasted, we continued our ascent, made summit, celebrated, and planned our return. Later that evening, when we got back to second base, we met our benefactor. He identified himself as Kelsey. And because of his gracious gift and clear victory over the summit, he was forever known as Kelsey the Hightower. Welcome to the stream, sir.
Best introduction ever. Thank you.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Maybe it's me.
Hit that refresh button. Technical difficulties guaranteed to happen. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, best introduction ever. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So for everybody who's not familiar with Kelsey, he is a staff developer advocate at Google and just a man about the industry, frankly, has been everywhere, has done all the things, has seen all the people. And I am absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to sit down and chat with you today. We have some questions that have been submitted by our community via the Slido. We're going to actually put the Slido link into the YouTube chat. So if you haven't had an opportunity to pop a question in for Kelsey in there yet, now is your time. To be clear, this is not a standard Q&A. Kelsey and I are just going to be chatting. We're going to be looking into the questions here to have some conversation starters and to keep the conversation moving. But if you do have a burning question and you want to get it out there, of course, now is your opportunity. Kelsey, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. The sun is peeking at me through my window, so that's pretty good for the region that I live in. And, you know, making the best of it, shelter in place.
That is super important, especially in these times. All right, so I'm going to hit you right away with the number one top voted question on the Slido as of right now. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Is there any sense in getting a Kubernetes certification of any type?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. A lot of people sometimes look down on these certifications. Like, some people believe maybe only going to college and get a CS degree. But you would think about it, most colleges actually don't teach Kubernetes at all, right? They're going to be a little bit behind in terms of what the industry standard practices are. So we rely on programs like certification. So when I started my tech career, I didn't go to college. And I remember getting the A+ certification. So for those not familiar with that, that's where you learn about, software, hardware at the very, high level. What's a video card? What's a motherboard? And I remember studying for that exam, getting my certification. And that was the way that I gained the confidence necessary to even apply for my first tech job. So I think for a lot of people, a lot of these certifications are just more of guided learning, some ideas that we can all agree on across the industry of what it means to have a base level of Kubernetes experience, right? So the truth is there is no substitute for real world experience. But for people that are new to the industry or maybe new to Kubernetes, I think having a certification, which is outpacing what you can get in most colleges, is a great place to start for people. So I think there's a lot of value in it, but it's no substitute for hands-on experience, but it's a great place to start.
Fair enough. So since we're not teaching Kubernetes in schools right now, I mean, that's could potentially be, an avenue to go down as well, is thinking about what a Kubernetes curriculum might look like in an academic environment. And I am interested actually to get your feedback on that. But before we go there, of the certifications that are out there, and there are a lot, are there any that are worthwhile that you know about?
Yes, I don't know. I honestly think the value is in the education itself, right? Maybe some people look at the piece of paper and recognize the logo better than another logo. Rarely have I ever seen a certification be the thing that gets you the job alone. A lot of people will look at that certification and maybe it may catch their eye in a resume if you're flipping through a bunch of resumes. But the truth is, it's like just the fact that you're going to have some structured learning path, right? You have an outline, you kind of see what the base levels are. So I wouldn't say there's one particular certification that's probably better than the other. What you really have to understand here is the value is just the education itself. And that's the thing that you should be looking for, and understand that even once you get the certification, you'll never stop learning about Kubernetes.
You will never stop learning about Kubernetes. I think anybody who's ever worked with Kubernetes can attest to that. Not only, I imagine, because it is a vital project, which is to say it's in constant development, it's in a form of constant maturation right now. Just frankly, the ecosystem is indescribably vast.
Yeah, and it's
used
just
everywhere.
cool, right? So it's just a tool. And for the most part, most people are just practicing other disciplines with this tool in the mix, right? You're not just learning Kubernetes to learn, right? It's like learning how to use a frying pan, right? You're really practicing how to cook. It's always going to be a different set of ingredients. There's going to be always something different to make. So these are just tools. They're not the end game, right? It's just something you use to facilitate something else.
That's fair. One of the questions that I get a fair amount from, especially, I don't know, categorize, but younger engineers that are looking to get into the game is, should I be doing Kubernetes? Should I be learning Kubernetes? If I'm doing a startup, do I need to go through the rigmarole of Kubernetes? And I like your answer there, because the answer sort of skirts that and goes, you need to step back and go, is this the right tool for the job, right? Not Kubernetes for Kubernetes' sake.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's value. So at work, when I was thinking about early days in my career, whatever the tools they're using at work, they're kind of paying you to ramp up on those tools. So that should be an obvious area where you go deep on. And a lot of these skills transfer. So if your company or startup isn't using Kubernetes today, you still need to learn about Linux. You still need to learn about networking. All of those fundamental things, you should probably be okay with going deep in those areas, even if it's first. And maybe on your own time, you throw in a little bit of Kubernetes knowledge to say, hey, what's out there? And maybe it is the right choice, but you'll never know that if you don't go and take a look and, dive in, even if it's on your own time.
That's fair. That's fair. That drive to want to learn new things, and that drive to want to push the envelope in terms of your own comfort level, I mean, that's where the innovation happens. I'd actually like to circle back to the idea of an academic context, right? So Kubernetes, vast, enormous, huge ecosystem, constant evolution. I can see how one could develop a certification program around that. But I mean, is it ready for academic rigor?
Yeah, so I remember maybe 3 or 4 years ago going to Stanford University, right? So in the United States, Stanford University is a really highly regarded, school, computer science. Actually, the founders for Google, if I'm not mistaken, went there as well. And I remember going into this, and there was a set of PhD students getting their PhDs in distributed computing was one of the kind of core disciplines in their areas of study. And they're all familiar with like Leslie Lamport's white papers around, logical clocks and these things. But a lot of people have never seen these things in practice. They've never seen these things and what their actual limitations are. So for a lot of people, even if you're studying some of these distributed computing concepts, something like etcd lets you really put your hands on some of the algorithms that you're studying. So while you're able to probably break open an editor and write a Rath algorithm from scratch, like cool, but what is it like in practice? Now you really get to deal with those trade-offs around networking and limitations. And I think that just helps people really turn their theory and maybe their higher level CS skills into something that works immediately in the workplace, right? So for some people going to college, one of the outcomes is going to be getting a job. So I think having tools to actually demonstrate, for example, in CS, one of the tools to demonstrate some of the theory is a programming language, right? So while CS is not about programming, programming is a way to express some of the theories and things that you're learning in computer science. And I think Kubernetes could be one of those things that's often missing in CS theory is about infrastructure, right? This stuff doesn't always run in that theoretical perfect machine, right? So there's real machines, and that stuff is so much more accessible these days. I think it would be okay to mix that into the curriculums.
Right. So, I mean, operations, harkening back to the era of system operators, sysops, and system administrators all the way through today, has really been seen more as an artifice of sorts, a discipline, not really something that you go to university to learn. And what you're suggesting is that actually, no, maybe this is something that could be added into a university curriculum, where we as an industry now are in a place where talking about infrastructure should be part of that, getting a computer science degree or getting a computer engineering degree.
Yeah, I guess it wouldn't be mandatory, but if I were someone paying for an education, and I've hired a lot of people fresh out of college, and one thing you wish is like, wow, I wish they would have taught you version control. You write some okay code, but you have no idea on how to collaborate with other people. And see, that's a skill that's necessary. So you just can't come with just a bunch of knowledge. You're actually interacting with human beings. So when we think about things like version control, developer workflows, and operations, this is all the things that are necessary to actually interact with the rest of the world. So this is why maybe I think if I was paying for an education, I would appreciate the ability to have some of these other tangible skills to complement my knowledge.
That's a fair assessment. It actually speaks to one of the questions here in Slido. You mentioned that you have a degree. Has it helped you in your career? Do you use the knowledge you received during your education in your career? And as a corollary, is high school sufficient for a successful job in IT?
Yeah, I have no college degree actually. So no college
Oh,
degree. And I've been doing all
I
of this on,
misinterpreted. I apologize.
yeah. Oh, no worries. And do I think a high school degree is sufficient? It has to be, hopefully. I've made it this far. And I think, honestly, the fact that you never stop learning. So if you got your college degree in 85, hopefully you were learning after 85, right? You will never stop. So I think the college degree, there's nothing wrong with any form of education, in my opinion, right? Sometimes it's too expensive. Sometimes you don't get what you really want out of it. But putting that aside, the fact that in this particular industry, in my particular career, it's always been the benefit of me continuing to learn things, right? So I picked up my CS knowledge as necessary, right? If I really want to understand something, maybe some of the principles underneath it, I would go back and kind of revisit those things. Or people who have a CS degree, I would ask them to try to give me a little bit more explanation if I think it would help. But yeah, I don't think there's a world where just getting your college degree alone is going to be the thing that's going to decide if you're going to be successful or not.
I would hope not, at least. right? I would like to think that people can work and rise to the merit of their ability. Speaking of 1985, let's talk about monoliths. There's a hot button topic. As an industry, everything moves in cycles, right? First it was thin terminals and thick terminals, and then we're all cycling through again. What do you think a phone is? Monoliths. We went from they're the only thing to they're the worst thing. We seem to be going back to monoliths now. You've mentioned this, on social media. This has been a subject of discussion. Do you want to see a return to monoliths? What's your standpoint on that?
I want to see a return to pragmatism, right? That's the key here. So when we talk about monoliths versus microservices, we're really substituting a different conversation, right? There are some people who look and say, while my use case is very minimal, I have like 0 customers or 10 customers, I want to pattern myself after Netflix that has millions of customers and a good reason to adopt a certain architecture. So if you try to copy and paste that with very limited resources, you don't know what you're doing, you don't know how to examine that trade-off, and you just say, well, microservices seems to be what the big people are doing, let me just do that too. Now you start to get into a problem. That just lacks all the pragmatism. You're just kind of blowing past any of the engineering discipline required to make sustainable software. So when that happens, we're just not really talking about anything of substance. But when you get back to pragmatism, most people can get away with a clean architecture. Whether you package it in a single binary or multiple little binaries, that's really not really a question here, right? Most people are looking for a good way to collaborate with the rest of their team. If you have a small team, maybe it makes sense to have really clean packages and decent interfaces between your code base and ship it as all one big binary, AKA the monolith. And some people will say, hey, my organization is so big, we almost operate like independent companies. And some people would say in that case, maybe you have 3 or 4 monoliths, right? One monolith for each of those organizations, and they all expose APIs and endpoints. And then there's this extreme where people say, it doesn't matter my organizational structure. I'm just going to define a box per service and end up with 10,000 services because I want to be pure. I don't want to have 2 services in one binary because it might not be micro enough. And that's when I think we're going too far off the deep end, right? So I think what I'm advocating for is pragmatism. There's proven cases where monoliths work for a lot of people. You might be one of those people. And if it doesn't work, maybe there's something in between that spectrum, right? Where you say, I have a primary monolith and I have a few services around it that makes sense. And that's okay, right? There's no need to be on one extreme end or the other.
That's fair. And as you said, it's a pragmatic approach. Out of curiosity, though, how do you get to that? How do you get to a point where you could be honest enough about your systems, but also honest enough about your capacity to build and maintain those systems where you can make those intelligent decisions? What are some markers to know that you're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I forget the company. They recently published an engineering blog about how they had to re-examine their decision to try to leverage a microservices architecture. And they believe that they just went too far, right? And they went too far and they kind of documented, and some people would say they did it wrong, or if they would have did it a different way, it would have worked out perfectly. I think that's kind of neither here nor there. But that vulnerability to say, hey, this is what we tried. We think we went a little too far. We're going to walk it back now based on what we learned. And here's where we end up. That's good engineering culture, right? You don't have to make the perfect decision the first time around and then just live with it. I think what you have to do is kind of have the ability to be humble enough to say, wow, that didn't work for us. The root cause could be we didn't know what we were doing. That could be the root cause, and I think that's okay. But you shouldn't let that bad decision linger longer than necessary. So I think that's what's required, being a bit transparent. And the age that we live in now, like 2020, where people are sharing their ideas, writing blog posts about it, getting positive and negative feedback, and using that as input to see if we should revisit a decision, that's how humans are supposed to work. And that's how you end up in a better place over time.
And that's fair. And it, again, falls in line with that idea of pragmatism, right? That ability to be critical, that ability to walk the middle path. That's super critical, or rather super important. And you see that in high performing teams. You see that in high performing companies, is that capacity to be critical, that capacity to question decisions. Speaking of questioning decisions, there's a number of questions in the Q&A that all follow along a theme. So I'm going to sort of touch on it with one, which is, okay, we did the Kubernetes. We have a bunch of stuff on Kubernetes. We don't want to do Kubernetes anymore. How do we stop?
Oh, I like this one because every time you get to a new peak, you get to decide what the world should look like next. You get to do some reassessment. Was this worth it? And I think for a lot of people, Kubernetes was a real eye-opener in terms of decoupling themselves from the machine, right? Instead of saying, I'm deploying to this Linux server, worrying about things like systemd and these various low-level concerns, we took our app, we gave it some structure, aka that container, and then we put it into this other tool. Now that we have this decoupling, we're free to step back and say, oh, what do I actually need from infrastructure? If I'm not talking about the machine as much, and I'm okay with some of the limitations and trade-offs of using something like Kubernetes, you know what starts to look real interesting? Heroku, Cloud Run, App Engine, Lambda, because now you're no longer thinking about, oh, I need Linux version blah, 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 or Ubuntu blah, blah, blah. You can now think in more abstract needs and terms. And then you can now start to evaluate these other systems. And guess what? In the case of Cloud Run, so at Google where I work, we open sourced a product called Knative. And Knative represents what is the subset of Kubernetes features that most people need to run what we call like an application or a service. And what we found is that most people typically only need one container. There's an ideal world where things will scale to 0 based on the number of requests, aka serverless. So like a auto-scaling service framework that could scale down based on the request. And then you need things like mount points and secrets and so forth. But that's just like the core set of Kubernetes that you need. And then a little bit of traffic management sprinkled around it. And then you can actually recreate what we would consider something like App Engine. So Cloud Run kind of represents a managed offering with that. So some people that are looking to say, hey, I'm doing a bunch of 12-factor style apps, maybe something that you would typically see in the container ecosystem, I might not want to manage a cluster anymore. And I think over time what's happening is that most platforms are not going to require a cluster to give you 85% of what Kubernetes was bringing to the table. And I think that's just a good thing.
Fair enough. So one of those paths to get off of Kubernetes, you've made the decision, actually, the complexity of it, or not even the complexity of it necessarily, just the feature set that it provides is not the feature set that we need. Conceivably, just going back to managing servers directly could be a thing, but also perhaps just shifting horizontally into the world of serverless, or shifting into an app management environment. Those would be logical paths, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, and it's a little easier now because think about it. Most people have a deployment object that says, these are the things we need. They have a container image that has all of its dependencies. So unlike going from a virtual machine into Kubernetes, the step to go to the next higher abstraction is just much lower because the whole workload is so well defined that you can almost generate the next workload specification from the Kubernetes specification.
Fair enough. I mean, especially if everything's defined in YAML anyway, right?
The whole world is defined in YAML. We just don't know it.
Whoa, that's terrifying. So there's a number of questions, and also, frankly, I'm just curious. Number one most rated question right now is, Kelsey, what are you actually working on now? Is it CrossPlane?
No, so CrossPlane represents like so one thing that we talk about in the world of CrossPlane. So it's an open source project that takes the Kubernetes concepts and allows people to generate their own control planes. And to understand the value of that, you have to look back a few steps. One would be, what were people doing before? So people were writing bash scripts, maybe copying them to a server and doing automation. And then we got to an era where we started to create frameworks around scripting, aka Puppet, Chef, Ansible. They gave us DSLs, they gave us a little bit more logic and a way to manage these things. But we're still kind of fundamentally in this world of scripting, right? We're targeting servers and we're scripting them. And then the era of cloud, aka the era of the control plane. This is when infrastructure started to be backed by APIs and not shell scripts. And once you're in that control plane world, that opens the door for something like Terraform. right? Terraform comes up and says, wow, if a lot of the infrastructure components are going to have these APIs, now we can start to compose those APIs by just calling those particular RESTful endpoints. The problem with that, though, is for every tool that needs to interact with the cloud provider APIs or infrastructure APIs, you have to do that in every tool over and over again. And you have to compose and model the various meta resources that you want. So when you think about CrossPlane, you can create meta resources. So this would be something like, I need a VPC, I need Cloud SQL, I need these IAM roles, and I need an IP address to put into Cloud SQL that only these people can come through via the firewall. So when you wrap all that together, and in the world of CrossPlane, you just generate a new resource type, AKA CRD, custom resource definition. And that custom resource definition will be something like Hightower's Cloud SQL with all that other stuff behind it. And then I only expose 5 or 6 parameters that will then make sure that you always configure the stuff behind it. And then that creates another control plane. So this CrossPlane allows you to take cross-cutting concerns and generate your own control plane. And I think for people coming from a systems background, we've never progressed to the point from scripting languages to having our own control planes that exposes only the APIs we care about. So we go from bash wrapper scripts to wrapper control planes. And that's the whole concept around CrossPlane. And that's intriguing to me because that's the next evolution based on where Kubernetes is today and the next logical step people should be taking when it comes to control plane. And the last thing to your question was, I'm working on things outside of infrastructure at this point. Things like gRPC are very interesting to me. Can we take application frameworks like gRPC, Spring Boot, and can you do enough of the stuff that Kubernetes doesn't do or the service mesh doesn't do? And that's have to live inside of the app, right? That stuff won't make sense to push into the binaries below us. So that area is super interesting to me right now, and gRPC is where I'm spending a little bit of my time.
So one of the, I don't want to say criticisms, but observations that gets made by a lot of people working in IT, especially people working in, say, DevOps or, mid-career developers, is that we're just people implementing tools. We're not necessarily building or evolving the state of the art, right? We're just like, here are some interfaces, here is some software, and now we're using it, and now I get paid. Do you have any ideas for the audience, the viewers at home, how to move from, okay, I just bang a hammer against a nail to I've invented a new hammer, or I've invented a new thing that didn't exist before? Could it be gRPC?
Yeah, this has a lot more to do with the people problem, right? If you get a lot of people that have to live with the decision of the previous set of people, then that becomes the culture. So the tools just happen to be there that implement the culture. Some of the tools serialize the culture, like CI/CD and ticketing systems typically serialize the culture. And once that culture is well ingrained, anyone new coming in will not have enough power to change the culture quickly at all, right? So this is why you hear a lot of people say, oh, we're working on changing the culture. But what they underestimate is the force necessary. If you have 10,000 people stuck in that culture, 2 or 3 people can't do anything. Very rarely can they do anything. Unless they can fire everyone, then now you have fear, which would be the equal forcing function. Going out of business is another forcing function, right? We're going to be out of business. And then you see people change a little bit quicker because they want to stay in business. So that cultural part is super hard because once it's defined, it's hard to change. Now, that doesn't exist for everyone. There are some companies, I remember going to a KubeCon, and we were in one of those circles. We call them the hallway tracks. And I remember everyone's talking about their Kubernetes setup. Oh, I have 10 nodes. I have 1,000 nodes. I got Prometheus. Like, people were just going on and on. And there was this group of people standing to the side, and they're like, yeah, I don't want no parts of that. We've been using App Engine for 6 years. And all we do, and they make money. They have a real business. They work at a real company. They write apps. They deal with the limitations of App Engine, and they deploy apps. So for them, this world is not a problem for them. Now you would say, oh, well, our company doesn't get to do that. Well, that's not the whole ecosystem's problem, right? Every culture won't be able to take advantage of 2020 innovation because their culture won't allow it. That's a different problem. Some companies are taking full advantage of all of the innovation that has came out in the last decade. And sometimes until you get to go work in that kind of environment, you may think it doesn't exist.
That's fair. And I like how you reference that is ultimately more of a human problem. It's more of an organizational problem. It's more of a, you might call a soft problem than it is really an issue with the tooling or the software or the product itself. To draw, this is going to be quite the segue. When we think about the tooling and we think about the life cycles of that tooling and how long these things can last, right? A decision that was made, in the 1970s could have an impact on work that's being done today. We're seeing it now, for example, with COBOL, right? Applications developed in COBOL in the 60s, we're running into problems today with them. Assuming Kubernetes is going to last, is it going to be a COBOL problem in 40 or 50 years?
So the good news about Kubernetes that it's only a thin layer on top of existing technologies. So that's the thing that people have to remind themselves of periodically. Without IaaS, infrastructure as a service APIs, what is Kubernetes actually doing? Kubernetes is taking a container, picking a Linux server for it to run on, taking some data about the results of that execution, and feeding it to a load balancer via an API call. That's what it's doing. So it's such a thin layer that it can be replaced, right? You can actually take your manifest from Kubernetes and throw it in Cloud Run. What changed? You're still running on a Linux kernel. You still have a load balancer. You're still dealing with the laws of networking. So it's just not so ingrained enough, right? It's a set of patterns and way of working. So maybe people get addicted to the workflow, kubectl apply, right? Maybe writing YAML, that might be a thing that's more sticky. In the case of COBOL, is that COBOL dictated a lot in terms of the machine that you could even run the language on, right? The libraries in the ecosystem was closer more to an iPhone than the Linux architecture we enjoy now at x86 and just this big ecosystem. So in that world, I think people kind of got trapped in the fact that you had to have a certain type of machine, and then those libraries assumed a certain type of machine. And the way people wrote code, they would link out to all of these machine-dependent libraries that makes it almost impossible to move because there are COBOL to Java generators out there. But you can't use them in most cases because you don't have the machine dependency. So until you virtualize the machine level, you can't do anything. So to me, when I look at COBOL, the mainframe and some of those underlying systems feel more like the JVM plus Java bytecode than it is like a language that can just move on its own. So that particular situation, and you know what the funny thing is? There are some people that are enjoying their COBOL. Like they're like, we're still making money. It's still super efficient. And they're going to keep, so their biggest problem right now is that they can't find anyone who wants to learn COBOL in 2020. There's no one like, you know what? Forget this Node.js, forget Golang. I'm all about that COBOL. That's not happening, right? So, and I think that's really the problem is that the skill set of new talent coming into the industry isn't there. And now that's creating some market pressure that you don't have the talent that you need to come in and keep that system going. So naturally, it's going to cause a lot of friction.
Yeah, that's fair. And to any of you young developers out there who are irritated that white space is significant in Python, man, you've never seen COBOL. It's a whole new world. So we're talking about sort of the longevity of things, right? That stuff can stick around. It can be sticky. Kubernetes is one of these things that could potentially be sticky, and part and parcel of projects, maturating. That's a Frenchism. Maturing would be something like long-term releases, stable releases, stuff that we know is going to be, okay, the code base is set, we're only going to be doing security bugs from here on out. We see this, for operating systems or even enterprise software. Is that a thing that you foresee happening in the Kubernetes world?
Yeah, shout out to all the people who have been doing Kubernetes releases over the years and all the people who made the tough decision years ago to define what core Kubernetes means. Like a service is core, a pod is a core concept, a replication controller is a core concept, but maybe a deployment isn't. And this is why deployment lives in that app namespace, right? Those things aren't core. RBAC is core. Maybe a daemon set is core. So when you start to think about that core being defined, it allows us to put stability in those areas, right? And the biggest problem I think Kubernetes will have going forward is while the scheduler and all these other components will stabilize, the things that will be hard to stabilize are like CRDs from the ecosystem, right? We have no idea about how those will evolve. So it's almost like a standard library evolves pretty quickly because that, or evolves a little slower because that's core, has really strong backwards compatibility promises. But all the other libraries you find on GitHub may not adhere to the same standards. And I think that's where you start to have a lot of pain. So hopefully the culture around Kubernetes and CRDs really try to lean on some of the discipline. And I think Kubernetes is only, what, 6, 7 years old. So we have to leave a little bit of room for us to correct some of the bad decisions or less optimal decisions that we've made in the past. Some people would still complain. It's like, oh my God, the jump between beta objects and stable or production objects means that some fields go away and it breaks everything, right? But to be truthful, look, we need a way. So if beta is the area where we have our last chance to make sure that the right APIs that get promoted to stable, we have to take that opportunity to do the breaking change versus carry something forward that we don't want. So I think that's just where we are. And I think Kubernetes is starting to get to that point where it's pretty boring in the core. And a lot of the innovation is happening on the edges.
Right, and that's you see this in any sorts of projects that take on a wider scope, that take on a life of their own, is they become more like the platform that stuff gets built around, on top of, underneath. And maybe that sort of addresses the question of what the longevity of Kubernetes looks like, right? Perhaps Kubernetes is the implementation of an idea, and it's actually the idea that'll be sticky, not necessarily Kubernetes itself.
Yeah, so I think a good project to look at its timeline is like the Linux kernel, right? So the kernel is super important for people hand rolling their own operating systems. And then we get into this distro territory. Slackware, Ubuntu, Red Hat, Fedora, and all of these distros get their own opinionated set of what the full operating system needs to look like, right? The whole GNU Linux, maybe you have a different system manager, maybe you have a different UX. And now I think we're entering to the distro phase of Kubernetes. Google Cloud, GKE. Azure has their offering. Alibaba has their offering. There's so many offerings, K3S. And K3S kind of represents one of the first examples where people are swapping out implementation details, right? Instead of etcd, you got SQLite, right? Instead of multiple binaries, they're all stuffed into one. But the Kubernetes ideas stay intact. The implementation's different, right? And you can see this also hinted in Fargate for Kubernetes at Amazon, right? So Fargate for EKS is more like, well, this isn't all the Kubernetes. Things, daemon sets may not work. Maybe some object types don't work. But for the most part, it's Kubernetes, and the implementation is drastically different from what most people are used to. So I think we're getting into the distro territory. And then after the distro territory, it may get buried by something else. So Linux trajectory for most people for an operating system, if you're in the Kubernetes world or you're in the Lambda or serverless world, you rarely talk about Linux a lot unless there's something in your way, right? Some, bug or security issue. But other than that, Linux gets buried for a lot of people in this community. And it's got to happen for Kube at some point. Something's going to sit on top and will probably bury Kubernetes as well.
How about Kubernetes right in the kernel?
No, we're not short on bad ideas that humans could be doing. But I'm pretty sure somebody's working on an ePPF implementation of Kubernetes just so they can prove that they can do it. But I just don't see any reason for it because now Kubernetes is like working well on Windows systems. My guess is that API could actually run on different architectures. So I don't know if that's worth doing, but you know what? I bet someone's working on it right now.
I bet, pick a thing. Somebody is working on it, right? Speaking of work, and I don't actually want to hold on to you much longer. We're already a little bit over time, but could I ask you just one last question before we let you go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Fair enough. This is actually a question that I sourced from my entourage that I really wanted to ask, and it's fairly straightforward. Can you dig into what burnout is like in tech? Like, how do you get to be an agent of change without burning yourself out? Because it seems like you managed to do it.
Yeah, so people doesn't, like, so when I worked in enterprise where we had a lot of big cultural challenges, you're going to do two or three jobs. You're going to do the technical job, and you're going to do this people, you're going to deal with people job, and you're going to play the political game. And it's not for everybody. It's not going to be 40 hours a week. I'm going to be honest with you. It's not going to be 40 hours a week. So when people say that they want to be a change agent, now you're talking 60, 70 hours a week. Now people would say that's not healthy. Well, change is going to require something extra. Remember, that forcing function has to be great. It's going to have to be greater than the thing pushing back. So you have to try to pick your battle. So for me, the way I tried to do this so the burnout piece usually to me comes when you don't see results. Because I can think back to areas when I'm working super hard and I'm getting the results. It's like an emotional high, right? You're still running hot, but you're seeing the win. So you celebrate at the end of that. And it gives you enough energy boost. It gives you the mental space to say, I'm ready to do it again because I know what's at the end of this, right? So you put all the work in. Now, there are some companies where you don't get the results. Same work, same energy, but at the end, you can't do it. We're not running that in production. Someone's manager comes and says, you better never try that again or you're fired. That result, there's nothing to celebrate. You did all of this work and there was no finish line to cross. And at this point, psychologically, you've had enough. There's nothing to say, let's do this again. And if you do that 1, 2, 3 times in a row, you're done because now you're just in this mental space to say, I don't want to do anything else. I don't know what the light is at the end of the tunnel. And for a lot of us, we may describe that as burnout, right? So I would definitely say in my career, and I've been very fortunate in the last 15 years that most situations where I've exerted a lot of energy, I had a really nice payoff along the way. So if someone would have looked at my real hours of work, they would like, Kelsey, you're going to burn yourself out. But I've been lucky to be crossing this finish line time and time again that I just keep running. Now I'm more responsible these days, right? I have a family, I have other responsibilities. So what I do is look for a little bit more balance. But the truth is my balance probably never returns to me to what someone would consider healthy because I keep crossing these finish lines. So I would probably say burnout has a lot more to do with the results of the efforts that you put into it. And even working 2 hours with the wrong outcome could result in burnout. So I don't know if it's just linked to time and energy output. So usually about what does the feedback loop feel like?
That's super interesting because a lot of the received wisdom around burnout is that it's all about working too many hours. But what you're suggesting, and it feels correct to me, is that it's actually more about the results of that work. And are you seeing the fruits of your labor come to fruition, or is it just, screaming into the wind? Right?
Yeah. So I guess to be clear, for a lot of people, once you start to take on too many things, even if you're crossing many finish lines, it's just too much pressure. For example, keynotes for me now, there's too much pressure. The bar is just too high. People expect this amazing demo, or I can't wait to see what he does next. So mentally now, the bar is so high. And here's the thing now, even if I do the keynote and it's okay, but it doesn't meet that bar, then that starts to weigh on you a little bit, right? And then that could actually turn into burnout where you say, you know what? I can't be thinking about keynotes anymore because the pressure's too high. I'm good at it, but can I be better at it? So sometimes you got to look at the list of things that you're doing and say, you know what? I got to carve out some of this stuff so I can focus on 2 or 3 things instead of 6 or 7, right? Because I think 6 or 7 may take way too much because everyone has their limits, right? I want to be very clear. Everyone in the world has their limits. And when you hit that limit, your body will tell you, your mind will tell you. And sometimes you have to have the courage to say, I'm done with that. I remember one year I just said, you know what? I'm done giving talks for the rest of the year. It's like February or March. I said, hey, I'm out. And of course, people will be upset with you and say, how could you do this to us? We had you promoted as our keynote, but look, only person that's going to take care of you is you. So when I sense that, and I'm actually having success at this point, I got my book is out, keynotes, I'm killing it. I'm doing good at the job. I'm being promoted. Like life is good. But I'm looking at this and saying it's too much. So you have to make a call. And when you don't make the call, That's when that burnout really starts to light up, right? You got 10 more keynotes at the end of the year. You're just like, man, I wish I could just cancel them, but you feel trapped. I just say, nah, I'm not going to feel like that. I'm going to take a little bit of heat. And then as soon as I sent out all the emails, I felt the pressure go down for myself. And I was like, all right, now I can focus on the other stuff.
Nice. Nice. That sounds really good, actually. I think I could use some of that. So, just out of curiosity, I know this is a fun question. Once you're done with tech, what's next, man?
Oh my God, that's been like 30% of my time is spent on that one. 30% of it. I read a lot about financial independence, what people actually need out of life, like the raw necessities. Because if you look at a lot of things that we chase and go to work for, it's kind of like man-made problems like software and bugs and troubleshooting and support. While those things may make our lives a little bit better in some cases, they're not the core things to life. And so when I peel back those things, I'm like, what are the core things to life? And I want to do more of those. So outside of tech, I plan to just like, not check the email. Like, what are you emailing me for? Because I don't want to be involved in anything that requires an email. I don't have a watch, and I plan to not need a watch going forward inside of retirement. And I want to go and just like figure out all the things I was missing, all the trade-offs I made in life that are more essential to life, right? Like studying like the different types of species the Earth has, right? So many people have no idea that this thing called life exist in more forms than just the things we interact with on a way to and from work. I've missed out on a lot of that stuff. So I want to go and see it and maybe even touch it. So for me, after tech, it's like, wow, maybe I can buy my freedom to be just a human and not a developer or engineer. Strip the titles and I get to return back to this core essence of life and maybe even help other people do the same. That's what I'm looking forward to when I retire from tech.
Inspiring words, and I mean that sincerely. So thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with me and to the greater community. This has been I'm honored, frankly, to have this opportunity as well. I'm sure there is a ton more questions that are sitting in the Slido. We don't have time to get to all of them. I apologize to all of our viewers out there, but Kelsey is super active on the various social medias. You can catch his recordings, and I'm sure we'll see him again in the near future. Thank you again for appearing with us. And before you go, I just actually like to remind everybody that we do have a virtual hangout that's happening after the close of this stream. So the administrators are going to post the link to that in the YouTube chat. Everybody is free to come by and check that out. It's just a Zoom hangout session. You don't have to turn your microphone on. You don't have to turn your video on if you don't want to, but if you do, you're more than welcome. I don't know what you're up to next, Kelsey, but of course, you're more than welcome to come hang out with us for a little bit too. Thanks again, Kelsey. A big round of applause.
Yeah, if you send me the link via email or something, I'll jump into that Zoom and maybe keep it going.
All right, that sounds great. We'll make sure to get that out to you right away. So thank you again. Sincerely, thank you.
Awesome. Bye.
Well, that's it for us on the stream today. I just like to once again thank all of our excellent sponsors that have helped to make this happen: Wix, Match Tech, ABsoft, and Shawl. I'd also like to thank all of the people behind the scenes here at DevOps Days Kyiv who have made this just a fantastic experience for everybody. It's a surprisingly small team that manages to put all of this together, and it has been my pleasure and my honor to work with them over the past couple of years making this event a reality. I'd also just like to remind everybody to check out yesterday's stream, check out the day before that stream as well. There's a lot of really, really good content. And also check out the descriptions for those videos because they contain links to drawings and also critically link to charity drive. So if you're in a position to make a financial donation to help people in need in Ukraine today, we would encourage you to do so. And once again, we also encourage you to come check out the chill out room at the close of this stream. Thank you to absolutely everybody who joined in today. That's it for us. Stay safe out there.